beginner, you might wonder what kind of forehand you should be hitting with. You've probably heard about the ATP forehand, the WTA forehand, the Classic Forehand, the next-gen forehand. So it's kind of like, what forehand do I pick? Or you could be a player that's played for a while and sort of plateaued with your ability on your forehand and are tired of not having a good percentage. If you're not hitting with a modern forehand, either the ATP or the WTA or even next-gen or next-gen plus or whatever you want to call it, you're likely going to plateau and not be able to improve. No matter how much you practice, you're just going to have a fairly low percentage when you're having a bad day. So it makes sense to change from whatever you're hitting with, in that case, to an ATP or a WTA forehand. So the question is, which one do you pick? To discuss it, I'll describe sort of the typical forehand that a beginner ends up with and why that doesn't work, and what they've done first to the Classic Forehand and then to the modern forehands, the WTA and ATP forehands, to fix those problems. The main element that sets apart the beginner forehand is that when they make ball contact with the racket face tipped up at some sort of an angle, like this, for example. If they're hitting the ball off to the side, so if I'm hitting this direction and they hit a ball off to the side, they'll typically do something like this. They'll take the racket back and they'll do this, and then they'll tip the racket up, make sure it goes up and over the net. If, on the other hand, it's a slow ball and it doesn't quite get to them, they'll sort of approach it, walk up to it, and then they'll do this and tip the racket up like this to get the ball to go up and over the net. Now, that works if they're playing a fairly soft game. Works okay. But if you play somebody who hits the ball hard, where you get a lot of variation of the incoming ball speed and bounce and spin, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. Tipping the racket doesn't work. The reason tipping the racket up, either like this or like this, the reason that doesn't work well is that nobody can time ball contact. If, for example, you've got a short ball and you're trying to hit the ball like this and you want about that angle on your racket to get the ball to go up and over and still stay in, it's fine if you can make ball contact right there. But if the ball comes in faster than you expect, you're going to hit the ball like here, and with a vertical racket face, it ain't going over the net. Or if the ball comes in slower than you expect and you hit the ball here, the ball is going to go long or over the fence. So if you're trying to make ball contact here to get the ball to go up and over with the tilted racket face, and the ball is fast and you hit it here, or if it's slow and you hit it here, you can see that's a huge angle difference, and that angle difference is going to make the results widely different. So there's from here to here, this is called what I call the contact zone, ball contact zone, and you want to make sure that whatever your forehand is that you're going to use has a racket face orientation that's roughly the same throughout this zone. You can see that this stroke doesn't give you that, especially if you're using wrist. If you do wrist, you get even more variation than you do with a full arm turn. So you can see you only get about half as much maybe angle change as you do if you do wrist. So you want to try and minimize that. That's what the modern forehands do, and to some extent the classic forehands do that as well. But the classic forehands have some problems, and that's why all the pros stopped using that and have gone to the either the WTA or the ATP or the next gen, and then there's a variation that's recent that people are starting to use as well, the pros are starting to use. So, if you're a beginner, or if you're an existing player that is using a beginner stroke, that's not a stroke to use. Don't use it. So the classic they used last century, and it worked pretty well for them, but they're all really good athletes. So you don't want to use a beginner stroke. The classic stroke, which I said the pros aren't using anymore, has a problem. They solve one problem by not tipping the racket face up at contact. We're tipping it up at contact like this. They basically make contact with a relatively vertical racket face. And, there could be a slight difference in angle depending on how high the ball is off the ground that they're making contact as to whether it's vertical or not, but roughly vertical instead of tipped up radically. So the classic forehand does that. So how do they do that? Well, they take the racket back typically like this, put it on edge, vertical racket face, and swing forward to contact. And typically make contact a bit out in front. And the advantage of that is, as you see, if I swing out in front, the racket rises a little bit. And that causes the ball to be lifted as you make contact with the rising racket. That lifts the ball, and that allows you to have a vertical racket face. Now, unfortunately, if you're coming from here and have a fairly flat stroke, you've got to be really precise in getting the ball over the net. So that's one of the shortcomings of this particular stroke. One of the other problems with the classic forehand is that if you take the racket back here, or in some cases, they've taken it back even further if they want to hit the ball really hard, they'll even bigger backswing. One of the problems is that this promotes a horizontal swing into contact. Typically, the modern forehands have more of a vertical swing. Typically, they'll be more vertical, and that gives it more lift. Also, it means that the racket is going in the direction that you want the ball to go, rather than around like this with a rapidly changing racket face angle. And if you look at videos of how to hit a classic forehand, you'll see that they'll say what you want to do is when you go to make contact, you want to try and keep the racket going out towards the direction you're hitting the ball, what they call the target. And you're trying to hit that point over there on the court. So keep the racket going out toward the target as long as you can. And that way the racket face then can stay in the right direction, right? That's difficult to do. You can see if I do this and try to make contact here and keep it going in the same direction, then keeping it in the same direction means that my arm comes across like this to keep the racket face facing that direction. If I do it from this direction here, so I'm making contact here, but I try and keep the racket face facing that direction, you can see, so I'm pulling the racket out of the path of the ball. So ball makes ball contact really difficult. So that's the shortcomings of the classic forehand. So what does the modern forehand do? What the modern forehand does is tends to make the racket take back more vertical than horizontal. You see some people take the racket back fairly horizontally and swing into contact, but with the ATP or the WTA, they'll take the racket up quite a high. WTA, if you look at Ash Barty, for example, she's way up here before dropping it down and swinging into contact. And if you look at ATP like Federer, you see him out here dropping it down and swinging into contact. And you can see in both those cases, you have a relatively more linear swing into contact. It's going toward the racket face is going toward the ball contact. You look at the WTA down here, like this. Or if you look at the ATP, like this, you can see the swing into contact on the ATP and on the WTA is relatively more vertical than horizontal, like the ATP, like the classic horizontal, like that. So you can see this is kind of swinging around, whereas this is swinging out toward contact. Now let's look at it from the side. So here's the classic swinging out, and then here's the ATP, and then here's the WTA. So that's sort of a overview of the ones that are used the most. The one I haven't really talked about is the next gen. The next gen tends to go with what's called a Western grip. The ones I've shown you, either the ATP or the WTA, you can use an Eastern grip like Federer does, or you can use a semi-Western like Nadal. And Barty used something like halfway in between, according to one coach I heard online talking about it. But essentially those two grips, the Eastern grip and the semi-Western, are used for ATP and WTA, but the next gen forehand, they go all the way down to the bottom to the full Western grip, and then they take it back something like this. And I can't even do it. I've tried doing it. It feels really uncomfortable. It's done for a huge amount of top spin, but if you're a club player, you're not gonna need that much top spin. If you have accurate strokes, you're gonna be able to beat the pants off your opponent. You don't need a huge amount of top spin. So I won't even really talk about the next gen. The last one to mention, the next gen, or the next gen plus, or whatever you want to call it, like Alcaraz is using. He's using something, and I think Nadal is fairly similar. Is using something that's sort of halfway between ATP and WTA. So instead of doing the ATP like this, or the WTA like this, they're doing something like this. So the one that Alcaraz uses, he's doing what's called overpronation. He's taking, and instead of going to horizontal, he's going all the way past horizontal to here, and then doing that. So that's like halfway between the two. There's a tendency to go more back behind him on that, which is what the WTA one does, whereas the ATP one tends to be out more to the side. Again, from the other angle, ATP, way out to the side, WTA, back behind pretty much, right, even with the body roughly, or even with the hip roughly, and then next gen, or I should say next gen, more back. It's still doing kind of a pat the dog back here into contact, just like here's the pat the dog out here, but the pat the dog ends up being more a bit behind them. So they get more of a whipping action, I think. Maybe they get a little higher velocity on the racket head speed. That's it. Those are the sort of basic bare bones of what the differences are between the two. The last thing to talk about is which one should you use. I highly recommend not using the Classic. You can do pretty well with it, but again, if you're having a bad day, you're not going to do very well. You won't be able to master it. So you got to pick one of the two, either the WTA or the ATP, or some variation between, like what Alcaraz uses. Which one should you do? I have switched from what was a Classic years ago. I gradually have switched, adding components of it. There's something called the windshield wiper, which is like this. The racket tips forward toward the net as you tip it up and over after contact from the side. There's the windshield wiper. I added that first to change my Classic from here and then swinging forward around like this and up and over the shoulder, do this. So instead of finishing high, I finish low. So I added that first. More recently, I've tried to switch to Federer's ATP, like this. Well, now I'm doing Alcaraz, so ATP. And I have had a terrible time doing it. I just have not been able to do it. I struggled. So then I said, okay, well, I'd like to teach both ATP and WTA, so let's work on the WTA. So I ended up doing this, and go like, oh, I can do that. So I was able within a few weeks to start doing that, where I'd spent like a year unsuccessfully trying to do the ATP. And it turns out the reasons for my success, I think, on the WTA was that on a Classic take back, which I've done many millions of times, is you take it down and put it on edge, right? So you're essentially rotating the wrist like this. So look at it from here, you're taking it back, and you're rotating the wrist to drop it down on edge. This is called supination. And so it turns out that supinating and then swinging into contact, I've been doing for so long, I can't not do that. What does the ATP forehand do? ATP forehand pronates. They do that. Instead of supinating like this, they do that and drop it down, right? So pronating was the opposite of what I've been doing all my life. And so for 50 years of pronating, supinating, I just couldn't do the pronation. WTA, you take it up and around like this, down like this. So look at that, supinating. So it's doing what I normally do, what I've been doing for 50 years. So I go like, that's what allowed me to do it, because I could then do that and then swing into contact. And so I would suggest, if you've been basically dropping it down on edge like this for a long time, start with a WTA forehand. Master that, and then if you love it and don't need to get it hit any better, that's a great one to use. Some of the men in the ATP use the WTA forehand, and it's a great effect. So it's a good one to use. It's an excellent forehand. If you decide you'd like to hit like Federer, just because you like how it looks, you can then switch to that. And most of what's in the WTA forehand, you can use the ATP forehand. And it's just a matter of going from supinating to pronating. And in fact, I would suggest that probably the way to do that is to like overpronate, do like an Alcaraz forehand. He seems to do okay with it, overpronate and then swing. And I think that'll get you to the ATP or to the next gen, or whatever they want to call the current thing that the pros are starting to hit with. So start with that.